May 14th, 1946. Fort Worth, Texas. The truck rolled to a stop in front of a ranch house whose paint had surrendered to the sun years ago. Dust swirled in lazy spirals as the engine died. Through the slats of the cattle trailer, 17 Japanese women blinked against the sudden brightness, their eyes adjusting to a landscape that looked like the surface of a hostile planet. Behind them lay months of ocean, weeks of processing, and a war that had ended but refused to release its grip. Ahead, smoke rose from a pit in the ground where 4 men in weathered hats stood turning slabs of meat over open flame. No grill, no seasoning bottles, no precision. Just fire, iron, and beef. One of the women, a former military nurse named Yuri Tanaka, watched a cowboy flip a massive steak with a length of blackened rebar. She turned to the girl beside her and whispered in Japanese, "They're burning it like a funeral pyre." The others laughed nervously, covering their noses as grease smoke billowed toward them. It smelled like destruction. If you're watching this from Tokyo, Texas, or anywhere in between, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. This is a story about women who crossed an ocean expecting punishment and found something they never anticipated, not cruelty, not comfort, but a slab of meat that would change everything they thought they knew about survival, dignity, and the enemy they'd been taught to fear. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when hunger meets pride, and when a piece of charred beef becomes the bridge between 2 worlds. They didn't know it yet, but that smoke carried more than the scent of cooking meat. It carried the first whisper of a question none of them were ready to ask. What if everything we believed about these people was wrong? The women had been captured in the final chaotic months of the Pacific War. Most were nurses, clerks, or communications staff attached to Japanese field hospitals in the Philippines. When Manila fell in February 1945, they scattered into the jungle alongside retreating soldiers. Some surrendered. Others were found weeks later, half-starved, hiding in caves with nothing but medical kits and fading photographs of families they'd never see again. American policy toward female POWs was murky at best. The Geneva Convention offered guidelines, but the reality was improvisation. By early 1946, hundreds of Japanese women sat in processing centers across the Pacific, waiting for a bureaucracy overwhelmed by millions of displaced souls to decide their fate. Some would be repatriated. Others would be held indefinitely. A small group, deemed low risk and capable of labor, were sent to work programs on American soil. Yuri's group arrived at Fort Worth in mid-May. The ranch wasn't a prison. It wasn't a camp. It was a working cattle operation that needed hands during the post-war labor shortage, and the War Department had made a deal. The women would work. They would be fed. They would be watched, but they wouldn't be behind barbed wire. The ranch foreman, a man named Clayton, who'd lost his left index finger to a thresher in 1938, met them at the truck with the interpreter who spoke Japanese like a man chewing gravel. Clayton's instructions were simple. Work starts at dawn. Meals are communal. Stay out of the main house. The women nodded, exhausted, and were led to a converted barn that smelled of hay, leather, and decades of animal warmth. That first night, they slept on thin mattresses laid over straw. The air was dry and alien. Through the slats they could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the murmur of men's voices around a fire. Yuri lay awake, staring at the wood grain above her, thinking of the hospital in Nagoya where she'd trained. Everything there had been measured, sterilized, controlled. Here, chaos seemed to be the organizing principle. At dawn, the smell hit them. Smoke, rich and heavy, threaded with something fatty and pungent. Yuri stepped outside and saw the pit for the first time in daylight. It was a crude circle of stones, filled with glowing coals and topped with an iron grate that looked like it had been salvaged from a demolished building. On it sat a slab of beef the size of a child's torso, blackened on the outside, weeping juice onto the coals below. A cowboy stood beside it, poking the meat with a stick. He wore no gloves, no apron. His hands were bare and calloused, stained with soot and grease. When he saw Yuri watching, he grinned and called out something in English. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, pride. She turned away, stomach tight with disgust. In Japan, meat was scarce. When it appeared, it came in slivers, boiled or lightly grilled, seasoned with soy and sake. It was treated with reverence. This was violence. The first week passed in a haze of labor and confusion. The women mucked stalls, hauled water, mended fences. The work was hard, but not cruel. The cowboys largely ignored them, communicating through gestures and the occasional barked command. Meals arrived twice a day in dented tin pots. Beans, bread, weak coffee, and always meat. The meat was never delicate. It came in thick strips or rough chunks, charred at the edges, pink in the middle, lukewarm by the time it reached their bowls. Most of the women left it untouched. Reiko, a former communications officer, wrapped hers in a napkin and hid it under her cot. "It's like eating a boot," she muttered. Yuri picked at hers cautiously. The texture was foreign, fibrous, and resistant. It tasted of smoke and salt and something darker, something she couldn't name. She forced herself to swallow, remembering the letter she'd received from her mother 2 weeks earlier. "We wait in line every third morning. The rice is gone." The others watched her eat. No one spoke. Hunger was a silent negotiator. By the second week, something shifted. The women began to notice patterns. The cowboys cooked at specific times, always over open flame, always with the same casual brutality. But there was ritual in it. One man always salted the meat at a particular moment. Another turned it at precise intervals, judging doneness by sight and sound alone. There were no timers, no thermometers, just instinct honed over years. Yuri found herself drawn to the pit during her breaks. She'd stand at a distance, arms folded, watching the fire breathe. The way the flames licked at the meat's edges, the way juice pooled in the grooves of the iron grate, hissing as it dripped onto coals. The way the cowboys moved around it with a choreography that looked like chaos, but wasn't. One afternoon, a dust storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned ochre. Wind howled through the barn, rattling the doors and sending grit through every crack. The women huddled inside, tying damp cloths over their noses and mouths. Through the storm, impossibly, the smell of cooking meat persisted. Yuri crept to the door and peered out. Through the swirling dust, she saw them. 3 cowboys crouched around the pit, one bare-chested, his suspenders hanging loose, turning a massive steak with blackened tongs. The fire glowed beneath him like a forge. He pulled a tin from his belt, pinched something white between his fingers, and sprinkled it over the meat. Salt crystals caught the firelight, sparkling as they fell. A boy appeared from nowhere, maybe 10 years old, barefoot and filthy. The cowboy sliced a corner of the steak, and handed it to him on the blade. The boy bit in without hesitation, juice running down his chin. He laughed. Yuri stepped back from the door. Her hands were shaking. She'd seen men burn bodies during the firebombing of Nagoya. She'd smelled flesh consumed by flame. But this was different. This wasn't death. This was something else. The breakthrough came on a morning when the sky was painfully blue. Clayton appeared at the barn with the interpreter and pointed at Yuri. Through the fractured translation, she understood. He wanted her to help with the cooking. She followed him to the pit, heart hammering. One of the cowboys, the one who'd salted the steak during the storm, handed her a raw slab of beef. It was cool and heavy, damp against her palms, marbled with fat that glowed white in the sunlight. She'd never held meat this size, this raw, this real. The cowboy set a cast-iron skillet over the coals. He gestured. Put it in. Yuri hesitated, then dropped the steak into the pan. The sound was instantaneous, explosive. Fat crackled. Juice popped. Smoke erupted. She jerked back, but the cowboy steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, nodding encouragement. He handed her a long fork. She gripped it, knuckles white, and poked at the meat. It resisted, then gave slightly. The cowboy gestured. Flip it. She slid the fork under the edge and turned it. The underside was crusted deep brown, almost black, with ridges of char like a topographic map. He cut a piece from the edge with a pocket knife and offered it to her. Yuri stared at it, glistening on the blade. Steam rose from the pink center. She thought of her mother's letter. She thought of the hospital kitchen where she'd once worked, where meat came in portions the size of a thumb. She thought of the women in the barn, watching through the slats. She took the piece and bit in. The crust shattered under her teeth. Salt bloomed across her tongue, followed by a wave of umami so deep it silenced every other thought. The meat was tender, yielding, rich with fat that melted against the roof of her mouth. She chewed slowly, eyes closed, and swallowed. When she opened her eyes, the cowboy was grinning. He said something she didn't understand, but it didn't matter. She looked down at the pan, at the steak still sizzling, and for the first time since leaving Japan, she felt something other than fear. That night, the women gathered around the fire without being asked. The cowboys laid out plates of sliced beef, still steaming, edges crisp, and centers blushing pink. No one spoke. Yuri picked up a strip with her fingers, the way the cowboys did, and took a bite. Around her, one by one, the others did the same. Reiko chewed slowly, eyes distant. Kazuko wiped her mouth with her sleeve, then reached for another piece. The younger girls huddled together, passing strips back and forth, whispering in Japanese. Not mockery this time, wonder. The slab sat at the center of the circle, diminishing piece by piece. What had once looked like brutality now felt like generosity. What had once smelled like destruction now smelled like survival. By the third week, the women had taken over the pit. Clayton provided the meat, the salt, the firewood. Everything else was theirs. Yuri learned to judge temperature by holding her hand above the coals, counting seconds before the heat became unbearable. Reiko mastered the timing, flipping steaks at the exact moment when juice began to pool on the surface. The younger girls prepared vegetables, slicing onions, with the same precision they'd once used for surgical gauze. They didn't speak much while they cooked, but they moved like a unit. A glance replaced a command. A nod confirmed readiness. They built the fire higher when the meat was thick, let it die to embers when they wanted a slow sear. They experimented with pepper, paprika, dried herbs from the ranch kitchen. Each meal became a small act of creation. The cowboys watched from a distance, amused at first, then respectful. One afternoon, Uri looked up to see Clayton, standing at the edge of the firelight, hands in his pockets. He met her eyes, raised an eyebrow, as if to ask permission. She nodded. He stepped forward, accepted a plate, and ate standing up. When he finished, he tipped his hat and walked away without a word. That night, Uri sat alone in the barn, writing by candlelight. The letter to her mother had taken days to compose. She'd crossed out lines, rewritten phrases, struggled to explain something she barely understood herself. Mother, the Americans cook like animals. No order, no measure. They use their hands. Their knives are dull. Their pans are black with years of soot. She paused, pencil hovering. Then she continued, but it tastes like freedom. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. Outside, laughter echoed from the fire. Someone had started singing a cowboy ballad that meandered through verses without apparent structure. A few of the women joined in, humming along despite not knowing the words. Uri stepped outside. The fire had burned down to coals, glowing like a bed of rubies. The smell of smoke clung to her clothes, her hair, her skin. She breathed it in deeply and thought of the hospital in Nagoya, of the measuring spoons and sterilized instruments, of the rules that had governed every moment of her life until the bombs fell. This was chaos. This was improvisation. This was survival without a manual. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of it. Their last morning came with the same golden light that had greeted them 6 weeks earlier. The truck idled in the yard, engine coughing. The women packed their few belongings in canvas sacks. A spare shirt, a tin cup, a notebook filled with recipes written in Japanese and phonetic English. Clayton appeared with something wrapped in butcher paper. He handed it to Uri without ceremony. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a thick steak, still warm, edges crisp with char. The scent rose like a memory. She carried it to the barn and laid it on the workbench. The old knife rested beside it, handle worn smooth. She picked it up and sliced through the meat's heart. The blade parted it cleanly, revealing a center that was pink and tender, glistening with heat. She wrapped one thick slice in wax paper, tied it with twine, and placed it in her pack between the letter from home and a small diary where she'd recorded everything she'd learned. Not a souvenir, a seed. The rest of the steak she left on a tin plate in the center of the barn floor. No note, no explanation. The cowboys would understand. The truck's horn bleated. Uri climbed into the back with the others. As the engine roared to life, she looked back one last time at the ranch, at the pit ringed with stones, at the barn where they'd slept and the fire where they'd learned to cook like Americans. The truck pulled onto the dirt road, heading east toward processing centers and repatriation ships. Uri's hand rested on her pack, fingers brushing the wax paper bundle. She could still feel the faint warmth trapped inside. She thought of her mother waiting in line for rice. She thought of the hospital kitchen, where meat had been a whisper, not a shout. She thought of the women around her, silent but changed, carrying the same smell of smoke in their hair. They had arrived as prisoners of war. They were leaving as something else. Not Americans, not cowboys. Just women who had learned that survival could taste like salt and fire, that hunger could be answered with more than precision, and that sometimes the enemy taught you things your own people never could. The truck disappeared into the Texas heat, trailing dust. Behind it, the fire pit cooled, its stones still warm. The knife lay on the workbench, cleaned and waiting. And in 17 canvas packs heading east, pieces of steak wrapped in wax paper carried a lesson that no war could teach and no ocean could erase, that food was more than fuel, that cooking was more than technique, and that sometimes, in the space between hunger and satisfaction, people found a language that needed no translation. The smoke had spoken, and they had listened.